On today's episode of ReFi Podcast, we speak with Rune Christensen from MakerDAO. He has been in this space a really long time, all the way from early Bitcoin days through to seeing MakerDAO as one of the first jigsaw puzzles of the DeFi movement. DAI has a circulating supply of over $16 billion, is one of the core elements of this money Lego economy. It's currently backed largely by USDC and other traditional assets, and he set forth this incredible vision in the Case for Clean Money on the Maker Forum, which is now passed in a governance proposal and is being enacted today, about how DAI can be backed by real-world assets to drive meaningful change, to support the climate, and address some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Hey, what's going on, Rune? How's it going?
Hey, glad to be here.
Definitely. John, how was ETH Denver? It was, I think our first time connecting since the adventure.
That's great. It's amazing how much more creativity there is when people are physically together. This is amazing, but to be together is a whole other level. And I really felt that.
That's nice, man. Well, I'm super grateful that you carve out time of your day. I know you've got lots going on with kiddos, and just super excited to talk with you about this clean money vision, this real world assets going on at MakerDAO. And I thought I'd actually start on a bit of a different tone. John and I ran a workshop with Gitcoin Kernel yesterday in this new regeneration guild. And we had a 90-minute session with 50 different people who were on this on-ramp into Web3. And when we asked, what's the number one thing that you would regenerate if you had a choice, the overwhelming majority voice was ourself. And I'd love to turn the question over to you to kind of look at what you do to regenerate and restore yourself, given the background that you have and the life that you live. What are some of those practices that you find?
That's a good question. I mean, So I'm actually a kind of person that I focus less on, there's this thing in crypto, right, in startups that you have to take breaks and remember to take your holidays. And in the foundation, when, we were running Maker as like a centralized company with a foundation, we had this practice of like forcing people to go on holiday, for instance, because often, right, people just like work and work and work endlessly, and you need to sort of be like, stop working, right? But I'm actually the kind of person that sort of naturally, I at least very early on, and it's just sort of my natural tendency, I actually like to work sort of less in a sense, and I'm able to create that space in my day by myself by, delegating and basically taking it easy. So, I've never really had the same need to sort of switch off and regenerate in that sense compared to, let's say, like a Solidity developer or something, right? I mean, those guys, they need to be like unplugged, regularly, right? Otherwise it's not really good. But like my thing is kind of, I don't work as much sort of during a given week, but then I don't really ever sort of fully unplug because you never know when something's going to happen, right? And that's the, like, I've found that approach actually works really well, because if you sort of try to work less and try to sort of cut down on your working hours and your working days, then you're naturally just gonna do things like delegating and sort of build structure that is more efficient and more sort of both in general, I guess you could say, but then also in terms of the time spent on doing stuff.
Man, I got to take a note from your song sheet. I'm really encouraged by that. And I know my wife would be. She's asking me all the time to work less. And I think there is a real strong trend in crypto to overwork. So kudos you for possessing a kind of countercultural heart and being able to embody that. I think that's really rare. And I guess it shows the clarity of mind that you've had by giving yourself time to be able to see things that maybe other people miss in the rush. I'm curious to step back a little bit and hear kind of the story as you see it now in terms of how you got into DeFi, how Maker evolved, and then maybe we start to touch on where this vision for clean money came from, and how you decided to start to respond to climate change using DeFi.
Sure. Yeah. So my journey into crypto is basically that all the way back in 2011, I just like randomly stumbled upon a Bitcoin address on some kind of, I think it was like a lulsec website or something, some early hacker or whatever, 4chan almost related thing back in the ancient history. And then I just went down like the Bitcoin rabbit hole immediately. And it was really this thing is so unique about Bitcoin and blockchain. The first time you sort of bump into it is this, it's the power in a sense, or the sovereignty, I guess you could also call it, right? Of like, here's a technology that actually cannot be shut down by the state and so on, right? And that just inherently is just such an incredibly fundamentally sort of powerful thing, right? That to some people, and then I guess me included, it just instantly speaks to some kind of very deeply to you as a person, right? And we continuously sort of see that where just now we have this example in Canada, right, where you have people sort of like doing a 180 on Bitcoin and blockchain, because they're like, oh, turns out it is pretty freaking cool when you have a computer system that cannot be shut down, right? Fundamentally, it just can't be done. But yeah, so I got into Bitcoin really early, and then I was running a small business back then, and basically took all the money from that and put it into Bitcoin like super early. Bought a ton of Bitcoin at like $2 and like $80. So that was great. But then I just I became like a real sort of Bitcoin maxi basically, and I just held on to these Bitcoins and went on the roller coaster ride. And then sort of by the time there was the big Mt. Gox crash and sort of hack, then I just I just went through this experience of losing so much money again and again, and it takes like a physical toll on you. It's a real. It's not just like a mental thing. It really sort of ruins you, like destroys you. To even if it's just paper gains you're losing, it's a horrible experience. I'm sure right now, like in the middle of this crash around, plenty of people know what I'm talking about. This sort of just like devastating feeling of losing huge amounts of money, right? Anyway, so, and the thing is, even though I was sort of up overall, I was lucky I bought Bitcoin really early, but just the thing that was killing me was sort of the volatility, right? It was like this experience of the roller coaster. And the reality is that regular people's not gonna, you can't use that in the real world, right? Normal person is not gonna accept that. Like a business, they can't deal with money that does that. And that just means that it's not really money, right? And over time, it sort of also pivoted towards more like being gold, right? And then that's where the need for for something that can act as money in crypto comes in, and that's what then led me towards stablecoins. And so I jumped into like stablecoins, like the early stablecoin projects back in 2014, like BitShares and like Tether was created back then. But specifically BitShares, that was this sort of invention. Like that was actually the first example of a stablecoin, and not just a stablecoin, but like a fully decentralized, like a stablecoin with the same characteristics or very similar characteristics as Bitcoin. And that just like that sort of really that was very exciting to me, right? That was like really checking some boxes where you get the benefits of Bitcoin and blockchain and the sovereignty, and now you're making it actually useful and like actually something that sort of now you can sort of like it's the stars are aligning in a sense, right? And so eventually these early stablecoin projects, they basically failed and sort of fizzled out, couldn't execute properly, and the conditions weren't completely right. And so me and a couple of other people from these early projects, we then went on, we sort of migrated to Ethereum once that really started blowing up. Before the launch, but sort of like after the ICO, basically, we then started Maker, and with this idea of, okay, let's just take all these various ideas around stablecoins, sort of take the best of each, and then build it on Ethereum so that we can just focus on executing on a stablecoin only, and then let sort of Ethereum handle the rest, right? Through synergy, as we called it back then, or money Legos and composability, as you know, it's sort of referred to today. And then that basically spawned all of DeFi, right? Because we built this basic building block, and then people just start building on top of it. And the project grew from there, and we went down. We sort of went into we realized that this issue of sort of the lack of quality decentralized collateral, which drove us towards real assets and that side of the project. And we also continuously dealt with the challenges of having a decentralized team and a decentralized workforce, and which finally culminated in the dissolution of the foundation, which is now underway, where the foundation basically built the project and created the protocol, but nowadays it's like an empty sort of entity that it doesn't do anything other than just wind down its relationships today. And instead, you have this real decentralized workforce that's running the entire DAO. And I think that's completely unique to Maker. Like, there's really nothing like Maker when it comes to like completely decentralized governance, completely decentralized operations, absolutely no type of sort of hierarchy or leadership structure. Which, I mean, it's really cool, but it's also very, very challenging, very uniquely complicated and challenging, because there's not really anything to lean on with that. And finally, that's then where once sort of all this stuff was in place, like it's like all the cornerstones were laid. That's then when I really, when I worked on this clean money proposal to the community as sort of a way for us to truly realize the potential of the system. And really sort of like just basically tied back to the original goal, which is to combine sort of the benefits of the blockchain and then the ability to do something that actually matters in the real world, right? And not just have it be about speculation, but have it be about using technology to, improve society, right? And there's no better way, I mean, no more relevant and crucial way to do that than to apply financial technology and DeFi to the climate challenge.
Yeah, man. Wow. You've been on a roller coaster ride. It's such a journey from way back when. I don't think there's many people in the world who've seen all the things that you've seen. It's like incredible endurance. What came up for you in that process, John?
I've got two questions that came to mind. So it seems to me that the essence of what Maker's trying to respect is the human right to have and use money. That anybody in the world should be able to hold money and use money. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons mainly why people can't have access to the use of money. Some of them are for financial inclusion issues, right? They can't get access to a bank account. And then some, it's for censorship reasons, because they're deliberately excluded from the financial system. And I think there's probably, I guess the question that came to mind is, under what circumstances is that right to have and use money not appropriate? And I think this is kind of pointing at this like anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism question. Is there a case in which financial censorship is an appropriate tool to use? And what kind of thinking and questions have you been asking with the Maker team as you've been going around designing DAI to, I guess, acknowledge that there may be a tiny bit of nuance to that right? Or maybe it's just a fundamental right. What do you think, Rune?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's like there's tons of reasons to do all sorts of stuff, especially if you're a government, right? And you have whatever law enforcement and whatever it may be, who knows, in the future there'll be weird geopolitical conflict and world wars and whatever we'll see coming up. But the reality is like that doesn't concern a project like Maker at all. Like Maker exists to create the most sort of fundamentally resilient and stable and sustainable monetary and financial infrastructure. And that's just what we do. And because we're building something that's decentralized, like we are very restricted in in how complicated it can be, basically. And there's simply no possibility that you can build in sort of, you know, I mean, it's actually, it's comparable to this concept of, you know, like encryption backdoors and that kind of stuff, right? Backdoors that only works for the good guys and so on. Like that just, there's no possibility that you can build centralization. I mean, because that's what it requires, right? Like some kind of centralized control into a decentralized system without it then just becoming a centralized system. I mean, that's just fundamentally how it works, right? Because decentralization and resilience occurs sort of when you have no weak link, right? Or rather, it's determined by the weakest link, essentially. So in that sense, I mean, there's just no, like, we just, from our perspective, we are defending against sort of the ability to censor and the ability to seize the funds and so on. But then the thing is that's sort of at the, I mean, that's at the protocol level, right? Because that Maker is sort of an underlying protocol that others build on top of. And I mean, the way that in practice, the way that you see things, like, I mean, all the criminals in crypto are getting caught anyway, right? Despite the fact that crypto is decentralized, right? I mean, left and right, currently, right? We're seeing them. And that's because of all this stuff that's sort of built on top of crypto is still able to comply with the law and, you know, build in whatever backdoors and so on. And basically most of it is centralized in the first place, right? But the protocols themselves remain decentralized, crucially, and cannot be sort of compromised at their core. And that's so important because that means as a human, you still have that ability to access these protocols, right, directly, if you want to, if you sort of spend the effort to do it. But if you're sort of just going for the easy solution, then you'll be using something centralized. That's basically how it works. And this is, I mean, like the super sophisticated criminals that can use crypto to remain completely undetected and so on. I mean, they don't even use crypto because it's even easier to use the traditional system, right? Because you don't even need any kind of tech stuff there. You just bribe some guy, right? I mean, that's the reality. That's that the current system, it doesn't work at all in the first place at sort of catching the real criminals, right? And then, I mean, we could go down this whole rabbit hole of AML being a scam, essentially, right? Where it doesn't actually work, right? And has nothing to do with like fighting crime or anything. And it's an authoritarian sort of theater thing, right? Where it's about sort of power fetishism and, you know, like, yeah, authoritarianism, right? And sort of imposing a sense of control. And it's just one of sort of many trends of how I would say sort of our society is in decline in a sense, right? Because these things just, we can't fight back against something like AML that doesn't work, but everyone agrees it works. Or, you know, you can't bring water in an airplane, even though, well, you just can't. That's just how it is, right? And we're just getting more and more of that kind of stuff everywhere, right? And it's not going to stop. And the only possible way we can fight back is with these fundamentally resilient protocols and sort of infrastructure, right? That is incorruptible at its core, as much as it can be engineered.
I guess what was coming up for me as you were saying this is, you know, we have COVID-19, the pandemic that emerged over the last couple of years, and this really drastic totalitarian response that originally emerged out of China. And I think the West went, oh my gosh, like, look how, you know, that government is behaving. And then suddenly it became rampant in the Western world. And the totalitarian response, largely powered by technology in many cases, was a hugely oppressive force that really removed humans' right to make a choice. And this crisis captivated the hearts and minds of all of humanity, more or less. And we deployed trillions of dollars of capital in a very short amount of time and stopped everything for a virus that could only kill maybe 1%. And yet, unfolding beyond this crisis, we have this larger global systemic economic collapse alongside a biodiversity crisis, alongside a climate crisis. And I guess the question for me is, you know, at what point did you become aware that this large systemic issue of climate change was, you know, the right problem to point the power of DeFi for you personally and for Maker as an organization?
Yeah, so I mean, like I've actually always been, well, I guess maybe even before, if I'm big, I've always been a bit of, what do you call that? A sort of doomsayer type, right? So I've always had this sense that the world is a lot, there it's a sort of it's a show, right? And it's a lot more fragile than it looks, right? And so I guess for many years I've been aware of sort of the absolute disaster that is the sort of the climate trajectory, right? And the reality is the problem is not actually that's called the physics of what's happening with the climate. The problem is actually the sort of the psychology of what's happening with the humans as they're experiencing this, right? But then once I had kids, got my first kid like 2.5 years ago. At that point, then it just suddenly became a lot more real for me, basically, because then it's just like the problem is what's gonna, the problem isn't necessarily that the world will be completely flooded and, that everything will be a desert, like in whatever centuries or maybe just decades or whatever, right? But it's really like the conflict and the way that the human society will fall apart as this happens. So that means that this is actually a problem that's like it's a lot nearer than people think. And then at the same time, it's sort of now it's like like the action needs to happen immediately, because it's like if there's this lag in what we can do, right? We need to really make very significant adjustments now. And I think it is very comparable to Corona in a sense, right? Where what happened with Corona is that, right, they were like warning about it. I mean, I remember here in Denmark, like when it was really sort of breaking out across China and then in Italy, then the government in Denmark, they were still saying, there's basically no chance it'll come to Denmark. Like, don't worry about it. Don't be nervous. It's not really gonna, it's very unlikely. And maybe there'll be one case or something, whatever, right? Don't worry about it. They just sort of completely stuck in this sort of the status quo mentality, right? And then a couple of days later, just exploded in Denmark, and then they did a sort of a full lockdown, right? But at the time when Corona started sort of exploding, you had all these experts out there saying, look, we should take action now, and then we can really reduce the impact significantly, right? And basically nobody really took that proactive action. Well, some did, but mostly that didn't happen. And then we got these like lockdowns, and we got this overreaction sort of. I think it's similar to the climate, right? Where basically we don't really sort of see the real devastation yet, or rather, the devastation that we see now is still happening in this sort of boiling frog kind of way. It hasn't gone fully exponential just yet, but and once it goes exponential, then it will be it'll be a lot harder to deal with and a lot harder to adapt to. So anything we can do now to sort of try to fix it is it'll really move the needle, and it'll really sort of impact something like the likelihood that my children will survive or have a good life, right? So then of course I need it's very sort of a personal incentive to basically try to do what can be done.
Yeah, man. You said something that really struck me about it's not about the physics of what's happening in the atmosphere. It's about the psychology of what's happening in the human mind as we experience this. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as if, tomorrow, if people felt like it, we could end world hunger, right? I mean, in the same way that if we could just institute some kind of perfect communist, I mean, this is theoretical, right? Because it doesn't work, right? But some kind of communist, whatever, I mean, top down, centrally planned, some sort of, plan, and then we just migrate to renewable energy and spend a couple of years, consuming less, and sort of with the, society sort of in this transition stage. But I'm talking about like a kind of, a top down, globally coordinated, what do you call it? Like fundamental, right? Like transition across the board. If you did that, you could actually, it's not that big of a problem, right? Because the global economy is gigantic, and the technology, things like Gen 4, nuclear, whatever, all this stuff is sort of there in a sense. But the reality is that people are not, it's a tragedy of the commons problem, right? Where unfortunately, the worse so the crisis gets and the worse things get, right? It's like, we experience sort of, instead of getting solutions and getting sort of long-term solutions, right? And sort of stuff that actually works. It's almost like the more dire and desperate the situation gets, the more, the less the focus is on the long term, and the more the focus is on sort of short term, whatever, distractions, conspiracy theories, political showmanship, right? Like, I mean, and in particular, something like greenwashing, right? Which is basically what the way that the humans are dealing with climate change right now is like greenwashing, right? And the best examples of stuff like, the straw, the plastic straw turned into a paper straw, right? So now you have to, your straw has to melt, and then that's being done because then we feel like, oh, my straw is melting, and I'm dealing with this stuff, and it feels like I'm doing something, right? It feels like something's going in the right direction, but it actually isn't. Like, it's actually, it's sort of worse, right? Because you're just not dealing with the core of the problem, which is the economy and the financial system itself.
And the biases in the human mind, which prioritize short-term gratification over long-term benefits. The example in Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where they illustrate 80% of people would rather have one chocolate immediately than wait an hour to have 3. And there's a small cohort who have additional resilience and maybe vision and willpower who can just say, yeah, I'll wait for this. Or like, yeah, I'll sacrifice right now for tomorrow. But there's this kind of immediate gratification that our minds have been, I think, perpetuated into, especially in the digital age, where we're just kind of stuck in this endorphin loop. And we can't really get out of the psychology that's addicted to, those immediate desires being met. And so I think it's a fascinating illustration that you give to describe this kind of big world geopolitical coordinated response to climate change. And I guess, it'll be interesting to see what unfolds, but I'm personally very optimistic about, DeFi and the potential that this has to subvert the failures of the nation state to do just that. Whereby we've seen COP after COP, year after year, the diplomats of the world fail to make significant commitments and then fail to uphold them. And then we, the people, fail to hold them accountable. And so this movement in DeFi to leverage distributed ledger technology to coordinate capital to address climate change seems, like it has great promise. But I'm curious what you see as the core frailties, the core risks that you see in DeFi of not actually making a difference, or at least the difference required.
Right. The fundamental problem is that it's a tragedy of the commons situation, right? So, like and that is really the basic challenge of what we're dealing with. It's kind of like this thing where sometimes we have some vegetarian going like, I'm a vegetarian, I don't eat meat, and then you have other people being like, oh, for every steak you don't eat, I'll eat an extra steak, right? And it's a little bit of that sort of. I mean, the governments are failing to deal with climate change, and the companies are failing to deal with climate change. And unfortunately, it's not that like if we in DeFi, we then deal with it, then they don't have to deal with it. It's not like that. It's like we have to do it, and they have to do it, and everybody have to do it. And if like just, one, I don't know, big country or something decides not to sort of, cooperate and basically defect from the game theory in a sense, then the whole thing falls apart just because of how everything is built around fossil fuels, right? The entire economy, everything. It's just so like the challenge of actual sustainability is so much greater than people think, right? Because we're led to believe that it's stuff like, oh, paper straws, right? That's what, like, do a bit of recycling, then you're sustainable. I mean, the reality is that, we can't really maintain our lifestyles. Like they're not really, I think that's not completely, like, it's not, I don't think it's completely clear, right? It's like, it's a bit of a probability spectrum in a sense where we don't exactly know what the future will hold and sort of what path do we have to take to be able to make it. But I think that like ultimately what needs to happen, like, it's like everyone needs to be aware of this, right? In the same way that so Corona is something that everyone got aware of, and that critical mass can then hopefully create the systemic change, and that's where I think like what DeFi can really do, I think, is basically to try to sort of push and get some kind of snowball effect going, right? And in Maker in particular, I mean, that's one of our really big focuses, is how we have this connection to big institutions, right? And that's sort of our, like, a big part of how I see the potential is that Maker can sort of help push and accelerate this ESG trend that already exists, right? And not just that, but then also help try to sort of push towards, the legitimate sort of ESG stuff versus the greenwashing, right? Because the natural incentive right now is that it's to do ESG and then do stuff that's not actually for real, right? But the greenwashing stuff, because the real, like, trying to go real sustainable is just, it's a crazy challenge.
I'm curious if you'd break that down a little bit for me, because I have to confess I'm relatively new to the whole DeFi movement and crypto. I got in May at the crash after I'd been looking for the right point of influence to address climate change. And I understand a surface level, and I'll have you poke holes in my understanding and provide a little bit more context. But in essence, what I see is, DAI is a stablecoin that's effectively pegged to the US dollar. And the way that works is there's some sort of stability protocol that determines which assets are held in a treasury to maintain that backing and that peg. And there's this kind of dimension of diversity and dimension of liquidity. And right now, as far as I understand, a large portion of that backing is USDC, which in itself is a stablecoin that's backed by the petrodollar in US held entities. And so help me understand what this transition to looking at real world assets and natural capital and the kind of three different collateral classes that you outline in Case for Clean Money, how this connects to the current stablecoin setup with DAI, and what it actually means to people on the ground and to climate change in general. I hope for you to unpack some of this for us if you can.
Yeah, so the Maker protocol and the DAI stablecoin fundamentally works kind of like a bank balance sheet, but sort of implemented through code on the blockchain, right? So you basically have a sort of you've got the deposits in the bank, which are the stable coins that are in circulation, right? That have it's not exactly the same, but you can think of it as similar when if you think of it as like a balance sheet, that you have these deposits the bank has, right? And then the bank has a whole bunch of assets that basically allows it to give people their money if they want to pull their money out of the bank, right? And so in Maker's case, that is basically to keep the price at $1 if the people want to sell their stable coins, right? And the way that money is created in a bank is, it's actually created, it's fractional reserve, right? It's created out of thin air. In fact, you can sort of think as banks as running their own stable coins in a sense, just in a sort of old-fashioned way, and of course in a very specific regulated system, right? But basically, what they do is when they do currency creation, they'll do something like give out a mortgage, right? Where someone comes and they have a house, they want to refinance, so they have the house, it's worth $2 million, and then the bank will basically lend them, let's say, I don't know, $1 million, right? Or whatever, let's say $1 million, right? And that $1 million that you then get from the bank, that's not like the bank doesn't have $1 million laying around. The bank only has to have the reserve ratio laying around, right? Which is sort of so it has some money laying around, but it's not $1 million. It's maybe, I don't know, $50,000 or something. Like it's relatively low, right? And the rest of the money, they simply print that out of thin air and then give it to you. And it's like completely new money that's just created just for you because you took that loan in the bank. And that's how it works, right? When you get a mortgage, basically. Or at least that's a simplified way to try to explain how it works. And the reason why that still actually works and why that is stable and why that isn't completely crazy to just print money out of thin air is because the house has value, right? Like you put $2 million of actual value with the bank. So the money that's created ultimately comes from some kind of real value, and at least as long as you're able to foreclose on the house, right, and sell those assets, and they would actually retain their value and would end up being worth more than $1 million, then the system completely works, right? And then you have sort of edge cases like the Great Financial Crisis, where it can sort of break, in a sense, right? And then that's sort of the big challenge of finance in general, is sort of the edge, the tail risk. But Maker implements all of this just on the blockchain with code, and then in a sort of, I guess you could say, simplified way, right? But also more efficient and much faster way, right? When it comes to using crypto, because it's all programmable, right? It's all on chain. So there simply is code that is able to detect when you send it Ethereum cryptocurrency. That's really the basic case, right? And then someone might send, let's say, $200 worth of Ethereum. And then the system says, okay, that's $200 worth of Ethereum. And that I will allow you to then generate and basically print 100 DAI for that. If you give me that $200 worth of collateral that I can then sort of sit with, I can hold in the vault, as it's called. And then 100 DAI, which is worth $100, is just printed out of thin air in this case as well. And then it works because the Ethereum is there, right? And you can even verify it's there because it's on the blockchain. You can go to DAIstats.com, right? Anyone can do a real-time complete audit of the Maker protocol, actually, right? Which is pretty cool. And you can just, the money is there, it's guaranteed. It's in the code, right? It's actually, there's no backdoor, there's no central point of control. It's all automatic, right? The ETH is sort of backing the DAI, and you can only get the ETH back if you pay back if you return the DAI. So if you want to remove collateral from the system, you have to take DAI out of circulation, and the overall sort of collateralization, the overall balance of sort of assets versus collateral versus outstanding stablecoins has to always be maintained in these like healthy ratios that are then set by the governance of the system. And then this can then also just be applied to what we call real world assets. And basically what you're then doing is you're sort of almost like, you're sort of going back into making it even more similar to how Make works, because then you can just, it does require an ability to create sort of a link between the sort of the self-sovereign decentralized blockchain and then the centralized, sort of backdoor or sort of, authority-based real world, right? In practice, what we've found is that basically you use highly trusted counterparties to do this, right? So something like a trustee is an example, right? Or just like a big bank. And ultimately you just have to, there's no way to do like decentralized real assets or something like that, right? You simply have to trust companies, trust people, and trust governments and legal systems. And that you could then argue that sort of negates the point of creating a decentralized protocol for a stablecoin. But then there's still major advantages. So one is that the protocol itself can remain decentralized yet interact and sort of interact with centralized counterparties on a sort of risk-aware basis, right? Where you need to be careful not to put too many eggs in one basket. And then ultimately with diversification, right? So you can diversify across many different legal systems, many different counterparties, many different companies. Then you can achieve a kind of decentralized effect that's similar to a blockchain with hundreds of thousands of nodes, right?
Interesting.
And so that's how the mechanics of how, for instance, today we're doing, the DAI stablecoin is partially backed by real estate in New England today, for instance. That's done through a system like this, where basically the company works with sort of a third-party provider to basically lock their assets in a special purpose vehicle, right? Special company, and Maker then has a kind of Maker then holds essentially tokens that represent a claim on that company and an ability to force that company to liquidate the assets, turn it into DAI, and then return that DAI out of circulation, right? And so you have that link, and we have a lot of exciting developments and sort of projects that are moving forward, like that are really breaking the ice and sort of breaking ground on this, including actually Société Générale, which is like the third biggest bank in France, right? That actually came to Maker and made a governance proposal to the decentralized community to try to sort of connect their own token, that like a token with a legal claim, to Maker, right? As sort of an experiment to see what kind of advantages can you get from combining these things. And then the last step, I mean, once it's proven that it works, that you can use DeFi, you can use sort of the advantages of the blockchain to actually allocate capital, allocate collateral in the real world. Then the question is sort of what should you do with that power, in a sense, right? And basically, I think that it's actually sort of the natural selfish choice for a decentralized system that tries to issue currency to pursue a kind of let's call it an altruistic approach, right? Or rather, I would say it's actually not really altruistic. It's actually self-serving to make sure that there's a lot of public good in what Maker does when it interacts with the real world. Because basically that's how, because a currency is such a powerful product, essentially, and such a powerful tool, there's a lot of, it interacts with things like politics, right? Because it's so powerful, right? I mean, and we're seeing that now where like the regulators and the politicians in the US, right, they're going all crazy about crypto and DeFi. But what they're focusing on is entirely stablecoins, right? Because that's where the power is, right? It's like money really is very unique in that sense, and that's why it's going to basically be more resilient, I would say, right, and more likely to be accepted and adopted in the world, and less likely to be shut down, is like politically, in a sense, when you have if you sort of if you use, I mean, to quote Spider-Man, right, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So if you use your power in a way that society would sort of expect you to do, just like kind of a government would do, essentially, right? And so that's sort of one layer, that there's just this very immediate sort of selfish element of, which is basically the politics and the PR of trying to create a new currency and then making sure that it serves the benefit of the public and of society. But on a sort of a broader scale and on a longer term time frame, it's also just it's a question of survival, basically. Because you look at something like the US dollar, the US dollar is literally funding its own destruction, right? It's like people are taking their value and they're putting it into the dollar, thinking that this is going to keep their money safe, not really understanding that when they put money into dollars, then they put, let's say when they put value into dollars, right? That value has to go somewhere, because it has to sit somewhere and sort of be able to maintain the price of the dollar, right? And right now that value is going to stuff that's just, destroying unsustainable business, right? Because pretty much everything in the world is unsustainable right now. So it's not like this is a sort of a big secret or something. This is
but some of the most stable businesses are some of the most unsustainable, right? Fossil fueled companies have a great track record of delivering profit.
Yeah, and that's sort of the crazy thing, right? That it's money is all about and sort of the success of money and the success of something like the US dollar as the world reserve currency comes from it's PR, right? It's the brand of this is, you can trust this, right? It's really about this very fundamental lizard brain trust, in a sense, and that's sort of that's a problem itself, right? That everyone's trusting this stuff is going to, this, and that's what we just talked about, right? With this sort of the psychology of what's happening, that you just don't, want to or really can look into the long term and see that the reality is that the financial system is sort of eroding itself, right? Like the monetary system is allocating collateral towards financial activity that's funding sort of economic activity that's, fossil fuels or whatever, just like, companies just using having business models that use resources unsustainably, which is basically everything. And it's like chipping away at sort of its own, its own bedrock in a sense, right? It's like sitting on a tree branch and sawing off the tree branch, right? And like, and what's ironic is the more you want stability, right? So the more you put money to, like, the more you put value into things like the US dollar and money and fiat currency that's supposed, because you want stability, you want to be safe, the more you're actually funding this. And that's just crazy, right? I mean, that it should work the other way around, that if people want stability, then they should sort of put their value into something that actually gives them stability rather than erodes their stability, right? And that's then the idea that Maker and DAI can sort of try to pioneer that this is actually possible. What if you could create a currency that doesn't destroy itself, but instead a currency that actually, instead of eroding its foundation of stability, it actually grows its foundation of stability, right? Which actually is ultimately environment, right? I mean, the economy actually derives its value from the environment, right? So if you're not protecting the environment, you're not protecting the economy, and then you're not protecting the financial system, and then you're not protecting your collateral, and then the money goes poof, actually, right? As alongside the world, obviously.
And so there's so much in what you've just said, but I think one of the key ideas for me to get across is, if you want your money to work towards the good of our planet, put it into DAI as opposed to US dollars, right? Because you guys are in this transition to uncover how you can use currencies as a way to regenerate, the real assets that matter. And I think this was a really powerful thing to me that opened my eyes in reading your forum post, that I really didn't quite get DAI. I didn't quite understand it or really want to be, too connected with the community and the movement until I saw this transition away from being backed by these assets that I don't really care about towards being backed by natural capital, renewable energy, things that are driving value and sustaining the planet for both of my children's future and all of our future. So I love that. John, you broke out for a little bit there, but I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to chime in on, or I have a question that I wanted to touch on, but I wanted to give you some space in case there's something that came up for you.
Well, I don't have a background in finance and economics. So as I've been learning about money and learning what money is through my journey into the Web3 wonderland, I guess one insight for me was this realization that by holding money in my bank account, I am a source of demand for that type of money, right? Like, that's my kind of tacit endorsement of that species of currency. I don't know if that's the word. And then of course you get into, and especially the forum post you wrote, Rune, kind of really made me question, okay, so what gives my money value? And is that something that I value? Is the money I'm holding reflective of my personal values? So I think like that's a really kind of mind-bending and wonderful line of questioning to kind of go down. But I think there's then the next question, which is you opened the session by talking about how important it was that Maker is decentralized, and how you coming out with this forum post, like, you're just a member of the Maker community at this point, right? What have you found to be the reaction of the community in using Maker as a force for climate impact? Is it being adopted? What kind of criticisms did you hear, and how are you going about navigating this kind of bringing this phase of the vision to life?
Yeah, so this is a whole topic on its own, because Maker is definitely, I think, really the pioneer in like a real sort of DAO and an attempt at doing a real decentralized organization and decentralized protocol at scale, where decentralization is sort of for real, right? Because almost all projects that are DeFi or decentralized or whatever, they aren't actually like, they don't follow this, like they're maybe decentralized in some parts, but they have sort of a weakest link that is fully centralized, right? Whereas we sort of define decentralization based on the weakest link. And we actually don't really, at least, I mean, there actually are, I mean, there are plenty of weaknesses in the system. I mean, and Maker still needs to evolve a lot for where it is now, right? But generally there is a sort of broad decentralization, including the governance, including the decision making and the operations of the community, right? Which is really, I mean, the best example of that is that I have a very hard time following what's going on, and I'm just really sort of like talking to people and trying to like learn what's going on sort of behind the scenes, right? But for the most part, my information comes from the forum, which is the same as everyone else, because that's sort of where the information is, and that's where sort of the decisions are made. And and so the thing about DAOs is that they're very happy to talk about things and make this, sort of agree and decide stuff in principle, but it's actually executing on that, implementing it, that's a whole different thing, right? And so the clean money proposal and sort of the vision that I came out with, it was I think it was very positively received. There definitely, like there was a lot of there basically was a lot of skepticism around whether is it realistic to try to do, basically. But it was there was a vote, and it was sort of officially adopted by the community, and so it's now sort of an official, in that sense, like it's a proposal. It wasn't even me that made the proposal, so I made the post, but someone else actually made the proposal to sort of try to figure out, do we want this or not, right? Should we just shut it down now, or should we take it seriously? And there was an overwhelming support for that. So let's say morally, there's a strong support, right? There's a strong agreement with, the climate is important, right? Using DeFi for good, that's a good strategy, right? The climate change, that is really, the biggest challenge the world is facing right now. This is sort of the big opportunity for blockchain to show its value to society. So now we're sort of at the implementation part, right? And basically that is just so, it's a lot harder than, we knew it was very difficult. We knew it was very complicated, but then of course, once you dive into it, it's just still like even more complicated, right? And one of the really fundamental problems that I sort of learned about is just that there barely exists any kind of thing you can invest in that is actually sustainable. Like it just really is, like so much of the stuff that you can invest in that's that's sort of marketed as sustainable and has liquidity and has sort of credit quality. Isn't it? It's more like greenwashing. Like there's just like different levels of sustainability, and most of it is just, it isn't what I would consider sustainable. And this is also why this is why we call it like clean money, not something like, why I proposed this concept of clean money rather than something like green money or sustainable money or something like that. Because this concept of like clean is that like either you're clean or you're not clean, right? Like you can't be like, there's no such thing as like, oh, it's a little bit sustainable. That just means unsustainable, right? Mm-hmm. And the financial system has to be sustainable. If the financial system is not sustainable, then what's going to happen? Well, it's going to collapse. That's just the reality. There's just, that's sort of, that's semantics, right? That's literally what it means. Yet that's still how it's being treated. That's how ESG and so on is being treated, right? So that's a huge challenge. Like, and then there's this massive challenge of a decentralized community governed by token holders that may or may not show up to a given vote and may or may not care about details. How to sort of, to actually implement a kind of functions that are similar to what's going on in huge banking corporations, right? Because Maker is so big now that like we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that need to be deployed for it to make sense, basically, right? Maker, like we've done like, I mean, there's this example of real estate in New England, right? And I think that's a project that's borrowed like $15 million from Maker, right? And that's just, it doesn't do it. I mean, it doesn't provide any kind of real collateral to Maker, right? At the scale that Maker needs collateral. And of course, also, it doesn't do anything in I mean, that isn't even a clean money project, but if it was, it also wouldn't sort of do anything, obviously, in the grand scheme of things, right? If Maker was then out there doing another 5 billion of whatever, black box money, right? Black box collateral, where we have no idea what's going on. But then what? So, but I mean, of course, doing something like the first real asset real estate project, even if it's small scale, that's still so critical, because you need to take these like baby steps, right? You need to learn and experiment, and that's the phase we're in now, and we've been in that for a long time, and it's basically like, it's a lot slower than I would have expected, and that's because there's so many things that need to be experimented with. Like, one thing is like just creating that legal connection where now you can interact between a DAO and the real world. Then there is this question of what does it even mean for something to be clean, like an ESG framework that actually means it and isn't just for show, right? That's very hard to even figure out what how would you determine something like that in a DAO, right? And how would you apply that with fairness to the different counterparties? And then there's just like the question of how to scale this operationally, organizationally, right? All of these things, we're taking small steps on each of these fronts, but it's moving incredibly slow. But that's because the approach that we are taking and sort of need to take is, once it actually works, then it can truly scale, right? I mean, and that's sort of the concept. I mean, and that's also what you were mentioning, that like once it gets to this, like once these things are done, then the vision is like the holy grail is, currency that is promoted, right? Like all these like marketing campaigns. That's really what I'm imagining, right? Like marketing campaigns are just speaking to people that are climate aware and sort of want to take action, and they're tired of being told to use paper straws, and it's total bullshit. It doesn't do anything, but it's like that's all they could do. And now, what if you could give them an option to be like, what if you could take real action with money, which is what actually matters, right? That's what the politicians, they care about. They care about money, right? The companies, they care about money. Everybody's following the money. And what if you could, use that as a tool to get what you wanted, which is not destroy the freaking planet, right? And like I said earlier, it's not like that alone would even do anything. Like, even if Maker was fully clean and fully whatever, and millions of people start using DAI around the world, and there's billions of collateral, still wouldn't do anything on the globe in the grand scheme of things, right? But what it could do is it could sort of set a precedent and help create a momentum for this, and basically establish sort of this signal that there's money to be made to do actual sustainability, right? And also just like through so when Maker gets a bunch of capital and needs to place capital around, right? So then we have these counterparties like SocGen, right? Like the big French bank that came and made a proposal to Maker, right? And so they want to, initially they want to do just an experiment, but eventually we could turn around and say, look, we have tons of capital, very low cost of capital. We just need to place it with you, but it needs to be actual clean collateral, right? And then most banks are already dabbling in this stuff. And then by having a sort of a powerful, like a large pool of capital like Maker, really adding a kind of scale to this and a profit motive to this, being like, here's tons of scale, tons of money to be made. That will then, help build up these internal capabilities in the banks and affect their bureaucracies, essentially, right? It'll affect like their, careers and who gets promoted and so on. And that's the kind of sort of ripple effect that can make a difference, right? Because we need to essentially reprogram the entire financial system, right? Like the entire global system. And we can't leave any parts of it sort of unreprogrammed. We need to actually impact all of it. And yeah, and that is what DeFi can do, right? Because DeFi is about composability.
That's beautiful. My goodness. Thank you. I'd love to shift gears a little bit and hear more about the kind of evolution of the governance process at Maker as a result of this clean money vision. So I have to confess that I'm a bit of a kind of DAO and governance novice. I came into this really looking at a tool to influence climate change in a meaningful way. And so I have read through the forum a couple times. I've looked at other governance structures, and I understand kind of the core and the essence of this aspiration to try and align MKR holders with DAI holders, and to be able to create these kind of decentralized voter committees who have, expertise and wisdom upon which to then make these decisions about how the Maker protocol governs DAI and fulfills this clean money vision. I'd love if you kind of break down the core mechanics of this governance process, how it works, and maybe some of what you are learning along the way in terms of experimentation and kind of pioneering this whole process.
Absolutely. But so when I made this, I made the Clean Money Initiative post in sort of two parts, with sort of the visionary part around there's a big opportunity for Maker to really focus on climate action. And then as an attempt at this is how you could potentially implement that. And also how and there's an aspect of this, which is this concept that DeFi does have something unique it brings to the table that goes beyond just like a coordination tool or like marketing or memes or something like that, right? And that is basically financial engineering, right? I mean, you can do really advanced financial engineering with DeFi, and we just had a big crypto bubble that really saw that play out with the most crazy like Ponzi schemes and financial games and all this stuff, right? And of course, it all blew up and exploded. But I've this is a kind of a core belief I have as a part of this of also the opportunity of clean money is that done correctly, it should be possible to use this kind of financial engineering and financial gamification that we've now seen in DeFi, and that DeFi allows for, to basically incentivize people to do good, kind of, right? I mean, incentivize people and drive people towards sustainable behavior, right? Which is kind of typically something like that is used by by a casino to trick people to come into the casino and lose all their money, right? Or used by by whatever, right? Like it's something that's mostly associated. Traditionally is associated with bad things and sort of incentivizing and sort of tricking people into bad behavior. But I basically think that in a way you can think of the entire world as like the entire system, the entire global economy, everything, sort of the big sort of the climate bubble in a sense that's happening right now. That entire thing could be seen as kind of like one big Ponzi scheme, essentially, right? Where it's a huge game where we pretend the resources will never run out, right? We're playing that there's infinite infinite water and resources and the climate, infinite climate stability and so on, when that's not the case. But we just pretend that's the case, right? Which is kind of like similar to a crypto game where you pretend there's always going to be more people coming in buying the coin, right? And so to sort of counteract that really strong incentive, it's just so much more, I guess you can say, fun to play a game where you pretend that the world will never run out of resources, right? Like that's way more fun than being all, oh crap, have to deal with reality. That's not really that much fun, right? So I think we need to deploy some fun basically to try to drive people in that direction, as well as really exploring this sort of this profit motive and profit incentive of things like like clean, climate action marketing, right? Of like how, if that becomes a thing, I mean, if that really becomes, I mean, it's already sort of a thing, except it's greenwashing. It's not really for real in most cases. But it should continue to grow. And as that real readjustment occurs, there's a real opportunity in sort of being early. And that's one, and then once again, encourages kind of, incentivizing an early investment and sort of an early push towards this. So, right. So that's a background of like, why am I dabbling, or so why am I proposing financial gamification and sort of a governance streamlining in this direction to sort of support this vision of clean money. Now, the practical proposals that I made at the time, that was just completely rejected. So like, there was a lot of enthusiasm for like clean money and the vision and this sort of core principles, but any of sort of the practical stuff that I was, basically brainstorming at the time, right? And then sort of thought there were some cool ideas. That was for the most part just totally rejected. And that's, I mean, that's the beauty of it.
Dang, man.
And it's not like I can then be like, I mean, I don't have the ability or sort of the power or clout to try to overrule that, right? I mean, I can only try to do things, like it's only worth my time to attempt to propose things that people actually want. But what I've been doing since then is sort of try to get a lot of feedback, talk to a lot of the people, and just basically do a lot of research to figure out how could we then, I mean, what's a realistic way to do this, right? Both in terms of how to actually implement this clean money stuff. I mean, with all the challenges I mentioned earlier, right? Of both like just how to just doing real assets as collateral, and then the challenge of how to actually measure clean finance, clean collateral, and then how to scale up an operational capability to actually facilitate and operate all this. And then basically just create a lot of financial activity in Maker to then really make it a big sort of catalyst for growth and really sort of growth hacking. And I mean, I'm working on something that's sort of it's actually, in some ways, it's way more complicated than what I proposed in the past. But then on the other hand, it introduces a lot of new complexity, but to sort of actually standardize and simplify a lot of the existing complexity that exists in Maker. And one example of this that actually I think is like a good idea that's I hope will survive is this voter committee concept, which is one of the most sort of frustrating things in Maker governance today, is that it's very hard to know how a particular vote will go. Like, it's very hard to sort of figure, if you make a proposal, it's hard to get in touch with sort of the whales, like the voters. It can be difficult to know what they actually think, and then they might just vote it down. Like, you made a proposal, nobody comments, so you think, oh, it looks great, seems like there's no opposition, right? It looks reasonable, and then it goes to a vote and just gets voted down, and then it turns out it was for some reason that you just didn't know that reason, right? But if you had been given that information, maybe you could have adjusted the proposal, right? And so this idea of voter committees, that's an example of how to kind of create structure, create complexity that then reduces the complexity today of seeking out hidden groups and contacts and figuring out how to actually get in touch with the people that vote, and right, and instead sort of standardizing around an open process.
Nice.
And there's a lot. I mean, Maker is just so. I think it's an order of magnitude more complex than any other project in crypto. I think there's really. I mean, we have 20 of these core units that are all individually governed by Maker, and probably it's not even possible to come up with a precise number, but most likely more than 100 sort of employee-like people in the workforce that's working for the system, and just hundreds of counterparties when it comes to collateral and sort of collateral applicants and all these things, right? And so there's a lot to gain from trying to kind of simplify that in a sense, or standardize all of this complexity. And I want, I mean, and partially what's motivating me to do that is I want to sort of do, I mean, I see that as like, okay, why should we do all these big changes and all this like, like sort of this big initiative and big push and spend a lot of effort on transitioning how Maker works? Well, that's because, I mean, what's motivating us to do that is clean money, right? I mean, this is because now we can come up with a sort of compelling vision that actually can get people to spring to action. And interestingly, I mean, there is also an element to all of this. And I mean, yeah, this is actually the problem with Maker, maybe DeFi in general, but in particular Maker, that like everything is connected on so many levels that like, it's just, you can't keep track of it all, right? It's just like, there's too much. But like a very core principle of Maker governance that we discovered very early on is that like a DAO is decentralized, and a decentralized environment is inherently sort of, it's defined as sort of an adversarial environment, right? It's like something where things work even though people don't cooperate, and they don't want to cooperate, and maybe they even want to steal each other's money, right? I mean, they certainly want that in crypto, right? I mean, that's it's a very sort of Wild West, right? Like jungle in that sense, right? And the fundamental like in that kind of environment, for something like a DAO to actually work, it cannot be motivated purely by sort of selfish, like a profit motive. It just doesn't work, because like the reason why that works in like a corporation, like an oil company or something, even though everyone is a freaking oil company, I mean, they're probably all evil, right? Or whatever. I mean, maybe that's a little harsh, but like they're all incredible. Like, I mean, the executives for sure, right? They're only there for the money, right? If they had some way to just like take all the money from the oil company and just put it in their pocket and just like walk away with no consequence, they'd probably just do that. I mean, and the reason why they're not doing that is because they can't. There's all these mechanisms in place, right? There's like, but primarily there's basically law enforcement, right? I mean, they'll go to jail if they do it. And in a DAO, that's not the case. Like in a DAO, you could just theoretically, I mean, you could just like if you have a majority voting power, in a very simple case, I mean, this is the case for a lot of projects today, right? If you can just buy the majority voting power, or maybe even just sit around and there might be some whales out there holding tokens of some of the projects out there. They could just, any day they feel like it, they can just decide to make a proposal that, proposes to send all assets of value in the protocol to their own crypto wallet. And if they're anonymous, and like, they can just do it. And in fact, even, I don't know, it might not even be necessarily illegal, even if they're, I mean, that's of course, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, right? But that, I mean, the point is that it's a very different, very, very adversarial environment where there's basically no government, no sort of authority. There's nothing that's keeping things on the rails, basically. But it still kind of works. I mean, in the early days, it still sort of worked, right? At least for some projects, it worked, right? And I'm convinced that the thing, like what makes it work, is basically that people aren't just there for the money, right? Like there's
the mission,
community spirit. There's this like this culture. There's this sense of belonging, right? Sense of being together, and that actually creates. I mean, I call it semi-altruism, right? Like that drives people to do things like vote in governance, even though there's no, like in Maker right now, there's no reason why anyone should vote at all. You don't get anything from voting, and you spend some time doing it, and there's basically no benefit, or if there's a benefit, it's some kind of attack, right? It's like some kind of like you're voting to give yourself an advantage, which is actually an attack on the system, right? But that's not happening. But what is happening is people are just voting.
Sure. I would love to follow up on this, because I had the great pleasure in my own kind of journey of studying with a guy who I feel has really cracked the code on human behavior. And I think about governance from the lens of what are the core behaviors that need to happen in order for good governance to arise and good decisions to be made? And what are the decisions that need to be made in order to fulfill this mission? And what you just tapped on there is around like the incentives of one of the key behaviors, which is voting. And right now, the incentives are somewhat misaligned in a lot of these systems, whereby it takes energy and effort and time to discern a good vote and then to take the time to vote. And I'm curious if there might be maybe later on down the road an opportunity to have another conversation to hear how your guys' governance system is evolving in the kind of clean money transition. I think this is a really fascinating topic for everyone in ReFi to figure out how to create mission-driven communities that do provide a place for people to belong, but balance this dimension of making money with also doing good for the earth, and kind of figure out how to create a place that's safe to have hard conversations and make good decisions that are ultimately countercultural in an extractive economy. So I need to personally wrap up here, just because I wasn't sure if we were speaking today, but I'm so grateful that we were able to speak with you, Rune. It's been an absolute pleasure, real eye opener. Like, I've learned so much just from being here with you, and yeah, maybe there's other chances down the road that we can chat. And just want to say thank you for your time. I always ask everybody who comes and speaks with us one question to kind of cap, which is, if people listening here could do one thing that would support either this clean money vision or something else that is meaningful and important to you in terms of the change that you want to make in the world, what is one thing that people can do today, right now, listening?
I mean, definitely getting involved in maker governance and trying to in any way drive momentum or drive sort of like bandwidth, sort of decision-making bandwidth towards all of this just incredible challenge of trying to actually implement it. And I don't think it really matters like whether you are you're some kind of ESG expert. I mean, we would definitely love those two to come, because that's sort of, we're just missing that capacity. But even just like regular people with sort of a conscience, essentially, are actually also a critical part of the process of sort of figuring out this how to really create a project around. Like, it just has to be fundamentally good, right? Not for show, not for sort of PR, because that doesn't. I mean, that was what I was just talking about. That doesn't work in a down and long run. It has to be about really fundamentally some kind of altruism and doing good, because that's the only way you can, I believe, you can make governance work in the long run.
Awesome, man. So good. And where can people find out more about you? Jump involve. Are you active on Twitter these days? Like, where's the best way for people to get in touch with this movement and just see more about how this progresses?
Yeah, I mean, well, so you can follow the official MakerDAO account, which has been dormant for like a year because of the DAO, because the whole project decentralized. It's just recently reawakened, which is very exciting. It's like a big step for a DAO to be able to take control of its Twitter account in a decentralized.
So at MakerDAO.
Yeah, so that's at MakerDAO. I mean, there's myself at Rune Kick.
Yes.
If you want to follow me, although I don't necessarily, I talk about a lot of different things.
What's with the KEK, by the
amazing.
way? Where did
Sorry?
that come from? Why KEK? What's KEK?
Oh, that's one of the oldest memes on the internet,
Yes.
That's Orcish for lol in World of Warcraft, I think I made that when I was like
Orcish for lol.